Thank you very much. I feel very honored to be able to speak in front of such a knowledgeable audience, being a humble journalist here. I will speak about basically the challenges. I will speak about politics. I will use very few figures. I leave the figures to Bjarne and to Bassan. And as you know, the Middle East has very many flashpoints and conflict zones, and also they have the energy hubs, financial centers, glamorous financial centers like this one here in Abu Dhabi. But behind those, also in the oil-rich states, you have political, ideological, and sectarian differences. You have lack of democracy and accountability, besides the huge energy resources. And to this you can add a portion of religious extremism, but also young and frustrated populations. So altogether, you have a recipe for instability in the region. Since borders in the MENA region are to a large extent drawn up by colonial powers, the United Kingdom and France after the First World War, we must not take for granted that all the borders are there to stay. And as you know, the borders between Iraq and Syria has already been disrupted by the offensives of the jihadists in ISIS. And it may not end with that, because the aim of the so-called Caliph Ibrahim, or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is to expand his territory. So, some of his prime targets are the Arab states with rich energy resources, and I'll come back to that. So let's have a look then at the Arab Gulf states in the GCC and the Gulf Cooperation Council. So what are they more than oil and gas producing countries? Well, the Egyptians used to call these monarchies on the energy-rich Arabian Peninsula tribes with flags. What they mean is that the ruling families in many cases came to power by the help of the British, who used to be the kingmakers of the Middle East. They also mean that these families or huge clans represent themselves, not whole nations. The rulers give subsidies to their citizens. In the GCC states, schools and medical care are for free. The inhabitants don't pay taxes. In some rich states like Kuwait, the state even provides money to young men to get married. And these subsidies and this non-taxation policy is, of course, a way to buy loyalties. But the Gulf states are burning more and more of their own oil for domestic consumption. Saudi Arabia, with 30 million inhabitants, is consuming more oil for its own needs than Brazil with 190 million. These desert countries are also consuming a lot of water. And the desalination process costs a lot. And Saudi Arabia will face a severe shortage of water in the coming years due to poor rainfall, experts say. Since energy prices may fall, as we've heard from Bjarne, this non-taxation policies of the Gulf monarchies won't be viable forever. The day will come when they have to introduce taxation, and when that happens, there will be increased demand for political representation and accountability. The populations in the Gulf countries are extremely young and they're very urbanized. Nearly half of the population of Saudi Arabia, up to 47%, are under 25 years, but the leaders are very old. These young populations are connected to the world. In Saudi Arabia, where you don't have freedom of speech, and there are more Twitter users in Egypt, which has by far a larger population. Even though many Saudis, Kuwaitis, or Qataris are extremely rich, there are also poor people, especially in Saudi Arabia, and I'm talking about Saudi nationals, up to 15%. They're not poor in the African sense, of course, but some of them live in slums. And the unemployment rate is high among Saudi nationals, especially among the young. The educational system in state schools is not adapted to the demands of a modern labor market. Foreign workers are ready to work harder, for longer days, and less money. So the so-called Saudification program to replace foreign workers with Saudis is not functioning the way it should. And since any type of public amusement in Saudi Arabia, like cinemas, theater, concerts, or coffee shops where young men and women can meet, are banned, young people have to live their social life either underground or turn to the mosques, which means that there's a lot of hypocrisy in Saudi Arabia. And young people in the Gulf monarchies often tell you, in private meetings, that the royal families who control the energy resources don't have the legitimacy in their eyes. Many will also tell you that they don't consider the political borders of the GCC countries to be natural. These young people might either be Salafi, influenced by Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or followers of the Muslim Brothers, or some of them are liberal. So you have three different types of opposition, basically. But this means that the challenges are huge for the monarchies on the Arabian Peninsula. Reform towards constitutional monarchies would be one way to go, but in Saudi Arabia, the authorities have sent peaceful, democratic reformers to jail and meted out extremely heavy sentences for those who are just calling for democratic reforms. One of them is this man, a lawyer, Walid Abul Khair. He was the Olof Palme laureate some year ago. I met him and his wife in Jeddah this year, and a few weeks after he was sentenced to 15 years in jail, and his first baby was born when he was in jail. They just want to silence him. But you would say that the rulers in countries like Saudi Arabia, they actually need peaceful reformers for their own interest. Because if the peaceful reformers are sent to jail, what's the alternative for the young people? Well, they might turn to the radicals then. And they might look to Caliph Ibrahim instead. So the rulers should listen to them. But one young Saudi man that I met in the slums of Riyadh while I was doing my research for my newly published book, he said that all of us young Saudis hate the House of Saud. He was referring to the maybe 7,000 princes and as many princesses and their corruption. The House of Saud is an absolute monarchy with a consultative body appointed by the king, which today has 20% women. They went from 0 to 20% women representation. The king also has to balance between those segments in the society who call for reforms because they know it's needed for the sound economy, and the other wing, which are the ultra-conservative and the Islamic clergy and their followers. The Saudis are playing with fire, have been doing so for years. The dilemma is that the House of Saud has built its right to rule on an alliance with the most conservative Sunni clergy, the followers of Wahhabism, a sect that was founded by an austere judge back in the 18th century. They don't like to call themselves Wahhabi. They say Salafi. And there are basically two types of Salafi. Those who are loyal to the rulers, and those radicals who claim that the rulers are corrupting Islam. Because of this alliance with the Wahhabi clergy, Saudi Arabia has a powerful moral police. It has Sharia courts who mete out arbitrary sentences without a written penal code. It's the only country in the world without a written penal code. There are punishments like whiplashes and beheadings, as you know, and a possible defector from Islam could be punished by death sentence in Saudi Arabia. So this alliance with the Salafi clergy is also a reason why the kingdom is the only country in the world that doesn't allow women to drive, which they need for the sound economy, of course, instead of having private drivers. Women are not full citizens in their own capacity. They all need to have a male guardian. So even if you have a woman CEO, and you do have in Saudi Arabia, even if you have a woman billionaire, which you do have, or university professors, they need approval from her, a male guardian, in order to travel abroad, to open a bank account, to open a business, or sometimes even to do a medical operation, to have a cesarean, for instance. As we can see in Syria and Iraq, where the jihadists and ISIS have taken control, the brutal type of sentences used by Saudi Sharia courts and the ultra-conservative Saudi interpretation of Islam have got offsprings in other parts of the Middle East and the world. And during my 40 years of travels in the MENA region, I've seen how Saudi Wahhabi Salafi influence has changed one country after the other, turning traditional, tolerant Islam into new directions. But the rulers of Saudi Arabia, knowing this, can't cut the relations with the ultra-conservative clergy, since they have built their own legitimacy on the alliance with them. The Saudi state was created with the help of Salafi jihadists. During the 30 years of wars that it took for the founder of the kingdom, King Abdulaziz, or Ibn Saud as we say, to consolidate his power over a huge territory in the beginning of the 20th century, he used merciless warriors who helped him to conquer his foes. And these warriors, they didn't take prisoners of war. They had to succumb to the ruler or lose their life. And these warriors ultimately threatened the rule of Ibn Saud. This is something that comes back time and again in Saudi Arabia in its history. Take Afghanistan, for instance. The Mujahideen that later turned into Al-Qaeda were first heavily supported by the kingdom as long as they fought the Soviet enemy back in Afghanistan. But when those same people turned their anger against the kingdom, they became outlaws. This dual Saudi approach to jihadism is also seen vis-à-vis fighters of the so-called Islamic State in northeast Syria and northwestern Iraq. They have got support from rich donors in the Arabian Peninsula. Exactly who those donors are is difficult to track for outsiders. States have means of deniability. But the funding basically comes from the wealth of oil and gas. And while doing the research for my book, I met many sources in many capitals who were adamant in their claims that there has been an active Saudi support to jihadism in Syria before ISIS took control of Mosul on the 10th of June this year. One key suspect in this liaison business is the former head of the Saudi intelligence, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, formerly a very powerful ambassador to Washington. He helped to build up the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. In Syria, Saudi Arabia officially supported the moderate fighters of the Free Syrian Army. But the constantly repeated unofficial version is that the Saudi actors feeded jihadists in Syria with fighters, weapons, and donations, helped by preachings from ultra-conservative clergy, some of whom the kingdom is nowadays cracking down on. In March this year, ISIS and their rivals in Jabhat al-Nusra, another branch of Al-Qaeda, were listed as terrorist organizations in the kingdom. The Grand Mufti recently called the Islamic State the #1 enemy of Islam. But it took years until this happened in Saudi Arabia, that they listed them as terrorists. Prince Bandar bin Sultan was deposed as the head of the Saudi intelligence in March this year, just before President Obama's visit to Riyadh. The head of the CIA, Mr. Brennan, supposedly demanded that Prince Bandar bin Sultan be removed from office before Obama's visit. Prince Bandar is virulently anti-Shia, and so are many in the House of Saud. This fear of Shiism and Iran's growing influence is the reason why money from the oil-rich Gulf countries have been pouring into the pockets of ISIS, often via Turkey's long border to Syria. maybe this map is hard to see from a distance, but the dark green color here shows where Shiites are living. And you can actually see that many of the Shiite communities live close to the largest oil and gas fields. The Sunni jihadists in Syria have thus been seen by many in the Gulf region as a military safeguard against the expansion of the non-Arab, non-Sunni Islamic Republic of Iran and its Arab allies, the governments of Baghdad and Damascus, plus Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was created by Iran back in the early 80s. But ISIS today is not only a threat for minorities in Iraq like the Yazidi, Shia Turkmen, Christian Assyrians, or Sunnis who disapprove of this firebrand version of Islam. ISIS has also become a potential threat against the ruling families of many Gulf monarchies. The aim of the Islamic State is to expand their territory and to consolidate their so-called caliphate. They started out in Syria by taking control of some oil fields in northeast Syria, water resources and border controls. They acted with a very long perspective. In Iraq, they established a tactical alliance with former officers of the Iraqi Ba'ath Army, plus many Sunni tribal leaders. And as we watch the horrifying war crimes of ISIS, we should keep four things in mind, to my point of view. One, there are many factors behind the creation of ISIS. Two, ISIS is also acting in a much more strategic way than the old type of Al-Qaeda. Three, ISIS is thirsty for energy. Control of oil fields obviously means power. And four, ISIS has internal supporters with Saudi Arabia, people who have been brought up with Salafism and who don't think that the Saudi king is the righteous custodian of the two holy places in Mecca and Medina. So the prime target for the so-called Caliph Ibrahim would be to take over Saudi Arabia and its holy places. And actually, there's a prehistory to this in 1979 when the Grand Mosque in Mecca was occupied, and the Saudis needed help by the French to remove them. So to understand where ISIS comes from, we need to also to go back to Iraq in 2003, when the Bush administration, Tony Blair's United Kingdom, invaded Iraq on false assumption. There was no Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, but they soon got some paradoxical helpers. One of them was President Assad in Damascus, who's an Alawite. He knew at the time that his regime could be the next target for the United States. And those were times when the Bush administration wanted to redraw the map in the greater Middle East, but doing so without a solid analysis of the region or the consequences of the removal of a Sunni secular dictator like Saddam Hussein. President Bashar al-Assad wanted to make the US invasion in Iraq as costly as possible for the Americans. In March 2003, Syria opened its borders for Sunni volunteers who wanted to fight the Americans. I was in Damascus at the time, and I saw this happening. In 2010, I interviewed President Bashar al-Assad, and I can confirm that he doesn't appear like a classical tyrant, but he is a shrewd dictator, running his regime like the head of a mafia clan. The Assad regime knows how to use non-state actors for their own interest. This is how Assad makes his regime relevant time and again. So a few years after Assad unleashed Al-Qaeda in neighboring Iraq, he turned the other way and started to cooperate with the Americans against Al-Qaeda. The US extradited terrorist suspects to the torture chambers of Syria, and this was during a period when the CIA outsourced torture to various countries. In 2011, when the Arab Spring had started, and when the popular revolt against Assad started in Syria, the demonstrators were peaceful in the beginning. Bashar al-Assad cracked down heavily on peaceful demonstrators, and later against the moderate rebels. But he also released numerous jihadists from prisons in the middle of 2011. Why? Because he wanted to create the perfect enemy. Jihadists that he could pinpoint when he said to the West that he was fighting terrorism, not an opposition. President Obama has withdrawn US troops from Afghanistan and Iraq and started important and highly sensitive negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program. He doesn't want to have US boats on the ground in the Middle East again, but he's now attacking ISIS in Iraq from the air, who ironically have taken control of heavy weapons made in the USA. In today's Iraq, Obama is a tactical ally of the Islamic Republic of Iran, to which the US has no diplomatic relations, and is also fighting actually the same enemy as the leftist Kurdish guerrilla of the PKK, who are classified as terrorists by the US, by Turkey, and the EU. So one could say, welcome to the Middle East, President Obama, where an eternal truth is that the enemy of the enemy is your friend. And now, just now, Obama is considering arming some vetted rebels in Syria, but this comes sort of 3 years too late. And another crucial question is whether Obama shall use US air power in Syria against ISIS. He would then suddenly stand on the same side as President Assad, who only recently attacked the strongholds of ISIS in Syria. This is the dilemma for Barack Obama, but that's the dream of Bashar al-Assad. This is the rationale for the Syrian regime, to get those who once turned their back on you come back to kiss your hand, literally or symbolically. I guess that leaders in Iran are watching this US dilemma with some amusement. But in Riyadh, in Kuwait, and in Abu Dhabi, there is deep mistrust, no amusement. This mistrust has to do with Syria and Iran, and to some extent with Palestine. In September last year, President Obama made his famous U-turn on Syria, which completely shocked the Gulf states. When everyone expected a US strike against military installations in Syria, Assad's installations, because of the use of chemical weapons, Obama suddenly declared that he would hand over the decision to Congress. And the Gulf states knew that what it meant. There would be no US airstrikes against Assad, although the red line that Obama had drawn up for Syria had been crossed. But from Washington's point of view, the mistrust against Saudi Arabia goes back to 2001 and to 9/11, when 15 out of 19 terrorists were Saudi citizens. That was a chilling reminder of how deeply Salafi jihadism is ingrained in Saudi society, ever since the foundation of the kingdom. Let me say a few words about the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two giants on each side of the Persian Gulf. The leadership in Saudi Arabia is old. The foreign minister, Prince Saud, has been in office since 1975. Maybe some of you have been born after that. The king is 90. Crown Prince Salman is close to 80 and allegedly suffers from Alzheimer's. And the arch enemy for Saudi Arabia is Iran, regardless of who's in power in Tehran. This was also the case during the time of the Shah. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Bahrain all have citizens who are Shiite. In Saudi Arabia, most of the Shiites live close to the world's largest oil fields. I think this is worse. Oh, no. I'm not going to use that. Yeah. In the eastern province. And the same thing goes for Iraq, where 3/4 of oil deposits are within the Shia inhabited areas, with the rest largely in the Kurdish north. In Bahrain, the Shiites are in a majority. The first time a popular Arab uprising was crushed was during the Arab Spring in Bahrain in March 2011, when the Saudi troops rode in under the banner of the GCC. Me and my husband were there when it happened, something I also write about in my book. Today, after ISIS takeover in Mosul, this House of Saud has basically two options: either to support ISIS in a clandestine way, using them as a shield and a sword against Shia expansion, hoping ISIS will be confined to Syria and Iraq and not emerge as an internal enemy. The other option is to try to accommodate with Iran, something Riyadh has been unwilling to do for years, and which has only increased conflicts in the region, including Yemen, another flashpoint today. But lately, there are a few signs of a tentative change. Iran helped to remove Iraq's sectarian Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, whose policies was one of the main reasons why many Sunni tribal leaders in Mosul joined forces with ISIS. And Riyadh was grateful for that Iranian initiative. And Iran and Russia are the ones who could remove Bashar al-Assad. The Saudis also recently hosted an Iranian deputy foreign minister, which might pave the way for a visit by Iran's foreign minister to Riyadh. But the big bang, of course, would be a summit meeting between King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and Iran's new president, Rouhani. But the latter will only travel to Saudi Arabia if he gets guarantees that he will be hosted by the king himself. President Obama, as you may think, probably has reasons to want to normalize relations with Iran, like Nixon did with China in 1972. Iran is a regional power whose influence you can never underestimate. But there are many hurdles down the road before this will happen, before there will be US-Iranian normalization. There's Iran's support for Hezbollah, its stand against Israel, and its nuclear program. The nuclear negotiations between P5+1 and Iran have their next deadline in November. Maybe this hurdle can be passed. And Oman, one of the GCC countries, is an active mediator between Washington and Tehran. And Oman never wants to go the Saudi way. Before I say a few words about Libya to finalize, let me just mention the differences between the 6 Arab monarchies in the GCC. Saudi Arabia is the big brother. Bahrain's rulers act as loyal and dependent little brothers, whereas United Arab Emirates want a sharper profile of its own. But both Saudi Arabia and the UAE have a common domestic enemy, the internal branches of the Muslim Brothers, which have been listed as terrorists for political reasons to silence a potent opposition. And you must know that both in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, many of the Muslim Brothers are university professors, intellectuals, and they have high positions in the society. Now, this fear for the Muslim Brothers is also the reason why both Saudi Arabia and the Emirates supported General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's military coup against President Mohamed Morsi in Egypt last year. Morsi and the Egyptian Muslim Brothers had waited for 80 years to come to power, and they did so after democratic elections. But they proved to be incompetent and gradually lost support on the street. And of course, the military and other institutions in the deep state were undermining for the Muslim Brothers. When the Muslim Brothers came to power at first via the ballot boxes in the Arab world's most populated country, this energized the branches of the Muslim Brothers in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Kuwait, and this created fear among the royal houses in the Gulf. Going back to the different differences within the GCC, the naughty little brother is Qatar, who has a very small population of its own. It's only 250,000, like Iceland. But it's immensely rich and has soft power. It cracks down on its own position and irritates neighboring countries by Al Jazeera network. Qatar also supported Muslim Brothers in Egypt and in Libya, which is the reason why you can no longer talk about just a Sunni-Shia divide in the region. There is also a Shia versus Shia, a Sunni versus Sunni divide. At the same time, Qatar and Iran, the two giants on the global gas market besides Russia, are rivals in the race of creating new energy corridors to the Eastern Mediterranean. They both want to reach the shores of Syria to the Mediterranean, something Russia wants to prevent. So this is also one of the many factors behind the foreign meddling and the war in Syria, the struggle for energy corridors. This leads us to the final discussion on Libya, a sparsely populated but oil-rich republic. I followed the revolution against Muammar Gaddafi in the spring of 2011. After going to Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, I went to Libya. I entered the country with high expectations, wonderful people, but with deep uncertainty. I traveled from Egypt through the old jihadi stronghold of Derna, who used to send fighters against the Americans in Iraq. I came to the capital of the revolution, as I said, Benghazi, and I went as far as to the military front line in Ajdabia. In those days, rebels with different ideologies were standing on the same front line against Gaddafi. They looted Gaddafi's military compounds and became heavily armed militias. But after the fall of the dictator, it was clear that they had different ideological or regional interests. They were considered to be the heroes of the revolution, and most of them are still on the payroll of the ministries. But the key question is, who should run these ministries? Who should handle the oil income of Libya? The democratically elected government under the former Prime Minister Ali Zaidan never managed to rein in the militias and make them hand over their weapons. On the contrary, Libyan weapons have spread to Mali and other conflict zones. And Gaddafi left a heavy legacy. During the 42 years of his bizarre dictatorship, he left no space for a thriving civil society, no party system, no culture of reconciliation, and of course not a strong army either, because that would have been a threat against him. Today, Libya has two rival parliaments who both claim to be legitimate. When I was in a tense Tripoli last year, people said that there were approximately 400 different militias operating around the country, some more powerful than others. This summer, one of the strong ones, the Misrata brigades, took over the airport and other strongholds in Tripoli. The Misrata brigades are close to the Muslim Brothers and supported by Qatar and Turkey. Other military factions are supported by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So here we stand today. In Benghazi, there's been heavy fighting between a branch of Al-Qaeda, Ansar al-Sharia, and a retired army general, Khalifa Haftar. But Haftar is loathed by those Libyans who see him as a potential coup maker and an instrument for the UAE and Egypt. Recently, Emirati fighter jets, possibly using air bases in Egypt, made airstrikes against the stronghold of the Misrata brigades and their allies. Meanwhile, there is still some oil flowing at the lower level from the fields in the far west and in the far east of Libya, up to 700,000 barrels a day, as compared to a normal production of 1.6 million. But Libya is a state in free fall, and its civilians are paying a heavy price. So this is my small introduction to the current tension in the Middle East and to the MENA region, places with so many lovely individuals, with such a historic depth, cultural variety, but with an acute lack of reconciliation policies and peaceful conflict resolution methods.